to our next episode of our ESG Paradigm Shift Series. Episodes in this series will examine different angles of the ESG phenomenon and its broader implications for finance and prosperity. Something bigger is happening in markets. Is ESG just a symptom of more fundamental shifts?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen. And today we are welcoming Greg Watson to the podcast. Greg worked in investment management and corporate finance for some leading City of London firms in the 80s, then joined Monitor Company where he became a partner. He then started his own independent advisory company and in parallel helped manage the startup of an interdisciplinary social science academic funding foundation. Over the last few years, he has been running an innovation investment experiment to test the importance of partnering and active stewardship for deep tech innovation, acting as a non-executive director of several companies. He recently published an article on the Social Convention Foundations of Finance called No Single Right Way, which has sparked a lot of interest and debate, including interest from me, and that's how we found Greg and asked him to be part of the podcast. We are so excited to have Greg on today to talk about this truly, to me, new way of thinking about ESG, about finance, about sustainability. It just blew my mind, and I think it will blow your minds too. So, Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Well, Kaitlyn, thank you very much indeed for the invitation and for your kind words in the introduction. Really pleased to be here, and I'm particularly excited having seen various things that ClimeCo has written that resonate very strongly with the mindset that we're going to be talking about in this podcast.
So, Greg, to open, you told me that debating the need for a third decimal point changed your career, which definitely wins the prize for the nerdiest fun question that we have done on this podcast. So tell us, what happened? How did debating the need for a third decimal point change your career?
Well, Kaitlyn, you're quite right. You asked me for a fun question, and I mean, this has to be the absolute opposite of fun. You've had a lot of other people talking about fishing and waste management and important things that they'd seen. But this one is really important, and let me explain how it came about. I'd had a niggle for some years about how I was being taught to value companies. And when I started doing my own thing, I was working on a project with some people supporting me. And we had a debate over how to go about a particular part of the valuation exercise. And a lot of the debate was about how many decimal places should we be using to calculate the cost of capital. Now, this was a private company in a very unusual position. And it just struck me this was completely irrelevant and absolutely the wrong way to go about things. And more to the point, I was surprised that the way that people were being taught in that era was leading them to this kind of accuracy and confidence in a particular approach. And I was trying to write a marketing piece. I've got a slogan, value through negotiation. And we've got lots of stuff on negotiation, and I thought, right, I need to write something on valuation. It'll be quite easy. I'll just knock it off in a few hours. I started digging, and I found one issue after another. We can go through those if you're interested in a minute. But it all added up to the foundations for this particular approach to valuation, which is incredibly common. It's taught as the standard approach in finance. It was taught then, it's still taught today. There's 1,000-page textbooks explaining how to do it. And the foundations just weren't solid enough, didn't begin to be solid. The modeling question is the capital asset pricing model. There's a host of textbooks explaining how to do it today. There's a lot of debate about how sustainability should fit in with it that hasn't yet been resolved. But underlying it, as I went through this exercise years ago, I couldn't understand how something that was so flawed had come to be so widely used in the finance industry that's full of very smart people, lots of them like me with some kind of philosophy training and other things in their background. And as I dug, I realized that there's a whole area in the way that social science is taught that really isn't covering what people need to be able to critique the kinds of tools that get used in business and other areas today. In looking to sort of find a way to explain it, I came across the notion of a social convention, essentially something where there's no single right way and there's a competition between different people to use the convention in question. The paper I wrote was in 2006. You'll find it on my LinkedIn. I called it Heroics, Sustainability and Common Sense, Evaluation Practices for the Future. It picked up on some early work by SSGA, who'd looked at what would have happened if they'd applied an environmental screen to their portfolio already back in 2004. The result would have been 1.6% per year better return, which is whopping. And one of the other things that I discovered was that the finance industry that I was in aggregate was assuming that over time profits would grow to be larger than gross domestic product. So anyone who reads that paper won't see a lot on sustainability per se, but they will see an underlying framework which itself isn't sustainable. The significant thing about talking today is it's now pretty much 20 years since these kinds of discoveries were being made. State Street Global Advisors was the first firm to manage $1 trillion. They'd identified this kind of correlation between investment returns and sustainability. And we're now 20 years on. There's been a host of empirical work done by a large number of different academics and investors to try to figure out what's going on. And what makes today particularly exciting is that it's 20 years on. 20 years is the typical time that if you work in deep tech technologies, those are technologies where there's a sort of an engineering or a scientific component. 20 years is the typical time it takes for those technologies to take seed and really get used. We're at exactly that point with a whole host of new techniques that might loosely be called ESG. And I think, therefore, today is a really exciting turning point where we're in the midst of seeing those moving from being slightly on the periphery to becoming really right at the heart of finance.
I think this is just really, it was groundbreaking for me to talk to you about this because myself, like a lot of people in the corporate sustainability or ESG investing space conversations, a lot of us came to this as subject matter experts in sustainability, not as subject matter experts in finance. So this was really groundbreaking for me, something I had taken for granted. And so I want to start by just reading a quick quote from the LinkedIn post that got me on the phone with you, because I think it's a great way to summarize what we're about to dive into. So just briefly, and we will include this link in our resource booth. You say, Greg, most sustainability/ESG tools are forward-looking and have well-tested empirical foundation, in contrast with many backwards-looking, theory-based, orthodox finance tools, several of which have been contradicted by empirical evidence. Much of the debate is overlooking that ESG type tools broadly, like you said, represent the next generation of data and stewardship in finance, and, having been evolving steadily for 2 decades, will now persist and grow. While there is no single right way, and we'll link that article as well, and I'm sure we'll get to that, no investor can afford to ignore this transformation to using non-financial, real-world information and investment, or the stronger foundations which forward-looking ESG-type tools possess. Boom. So powerful. I would think I was on the phone with you like within an hour of that. Huge, huge. This is huge. We're talking about the foundations of finance, social convention. I mean, this is really big. So let's go back a little bit. So how did your experience lead you into this debate? I know that you've already given a little bit of background, but I know there's some other aspects that you may want to share about how your experience led you into this.
Certainly. Kaitlyn, the story starts when I started work. It was probably the perfect time to start and see the foundations of what's currently the dominant approach in finance today. It was in the early 80s. I had arrived from a generalist degree, started in the city. Early on in one of my training courses, I recall somebody who was a head of banking in one of the big city organizations uttering the immortal words, "I don't read balance sheets, I smell them." So there was a culture, an environment that dealt with judgment and a whole host of things that people would do semi-instinctively, but based on a lot of experience. Almost to the month that I started, something else arrived, which was the personal computer. And because I'd done a 3-day computing course as part of my degree, I had 3 days more experience than probably anybody else in the team that I was in. And I commandeered a PC and managed to turn what used to be a 2-day task per month into under an hour. And you could see the power coming from the personal computer, and it came to dominate everything that was worked on in that environment. At the same time, also, the quarterly reporting trend came in. I was very fortunate to work with one of the, if not the leading team in taking quarterly investment management practices to the international investment community. It was the first firm to manage $1 billion in that way. And that was a lot of money in those days. So I saw the quarterly focus arrive. I'd grown up in the 70s. I'd seen how important finance was. I sort of had experience of companies that my father was involved with, which were leaders in technology, going bust because they weren't properly funded, being nationalized by the government. And so I was interested in impact, I suppose you could say then, and how you can use finance to make sure that companies are properly grounded and thrive over time. So that it was that combination of both being at the leading edge in terms of investment methods and technology, and having just been there early enough to see the end of the old way of doing things that gave a particularly powerful set of insights. Having worked for a couple of city firms, I was interested in working for a firm that was specialized in strategy, and I found Monitor Company, the strategy firm that was founded by a number of very senior Harvard Business School academics alongside Michael Porter. And I had a fantastic time there building up a transaction advisory business and sitting on a valuation committee with some of the leading experts in the field. In that period, I'd seen very experienced, seasoned clients making complex decisions about deals based on very simple models. They could be confronted with a developing market in acquisition, and rather than necessarily look at all the factors that might be involved, they'd simply turn around to me and my team and say, what does the model say? And of course, there are a lot of factors that the model didn't begin to take into account. And equally, I had a very long-standing old client who was a leader in the oil and gas industry, he turned around a couple of refining businesses in Europe. He'd become the leader of the UK oil and gas industry in dealing with government, which was quite something if you're a Frenchman. And part of his discipline in those days was by instilling a very strong focus on environmental disciplines and health and safety. They were of equal importance to financial measures in how he ran his business day to day. And he was sitting there, we'd have dinner together, and he'd be complaining that after working with me, he worked with a load of other investment banks. And he said, I've now seen what nearly all the leading investment banks do in modeling, and none of them look at the things that matter for running a company. So that's the background experience. And so when I wrote that paper back in 2006, it struck me that there were all these factors that in the future somehow should be taken into account in the way that companies were valued and investment decisions were taken. I can go through very, very quickly, if you like,
And
some of the issues in relation to the capital asset pricing model.
yes, I think so. I think that would be really helpful. So, and just for folks that don't have the finance background, myself included, the model that Greg has been referring to, I know you defined it once at the beginning, but the model is this capital asset pricing model that is, I guess, in question. So yes, please, Greg, do give us
the capital asset pricing model
example.
was conjured up in the 1960s. It was associated with the group of academics surrounding Milton Friedman in Chicago. The heart of the model, it comes down to how you measure risk. And the model basically assumes that markets are perfect, that the overall market gets risk right. And what matters for individual companies is the relative movement of their past share prices, which indicates the degree of risk that they expose investors to compared with the market average. When I was taught this, I thought, this doesn't quite ring true with what I've been doing very early in my career. It's ignoring real world factors. And I remember on a training course having a debate about it. Fine if it works, but when I started digging into it, these few years later, I discovered there was very considerable research showing that there was a far from perfect correlation between betas and future price movements, and certainly it didn't pick up the risk factors in companies. It was taking people away from looking at what's really going on in the real world. There are a few other things as well that if you start picking away and you just keep going. It was, I said, I thought it would be a couple of days' work. It turned out to be nearly 2 years. And obviously I was doing this just in the background of other things. But you then sort of come across people shocked at the level of assumed return in the marketplace. Some of the textbooks at the time were talking about returns of 7% premium over government bonds in real terms, which is a huge amount in the context of a low interest rate environment, and in the context of GDP growth of a couple of percent or so. It's clearly not sustainable over time. And what all this means is that the heart of the model assumes that there's some kind of equilibrium that the market and the people within it work consciously or unconsciously towards. And that equilibrium really just doesn't exist. The model is far too simple in the way it describes market behavior. And as I subsequently discovered, that pretty much all of economics is based on equilibrium models. And there's a lot, there's been a huge amount of mathematical complexity about it all. There still is a question underlying it all as to how effective equilibrium thinking is for models and for the purposes that they're being put to. And the final thing is, as I kicked off my career, we applied incredibly high disciplines in corporate finance when it came to profit forecasts. If you're going to put it in a circular for a client, it would never be for more than 3 months, and it would be reported on by accountants. Everyone would be really, really careful. And then suddenly, in came these models with 20-year projections, which were being used to base a whole load of investment decisions. And whilst when they were published, if they were published, they might be published with a load of sort of caveats and all the rest of it around it. But still, the idea of a 20-year growth rate and then perpetuity growth rates, these are very difficult, sometimes nebulous concepts to get your mind around. And as a foundation for long-term investment thinking, they can be pretty dangerous. And we still see those today. As we look at the small company market in the UK, you will see people doing DCF models, assuming the kinds of risk rates of return for valuing small companies that we might apply to big mature ones. And it's really very, very difficult to feel that is doing something that properly understands the risks and the milestones and the opportunities that those companies are facing. So those are the concerns that I had.
How is this relevant to sustainability? Speaking today, right? So this first of all, I just want to say I had no idea that finance tools were so debatable. I really didn't know, because it's not my job to do valuations of companies. And so I find that really interesting that there's actually that these tools are debatable in and of themselves. But how is this relevant to sustainability and ESG?
It's very directly relevant because of the mindset. The mindset here was, you remember, go right back to the beginning, the third decimal place. There's this feeling that if you just did things precisely enough, you'd get something precisely right. In the case of finance, you'd get a precisely right value. And then today, in sustainability, if you just get certain targets and benchmarks right, then you will solve all the problems. The world is too complex for that. And in particular, when it comes to dealing with sustainability today, there's a host of factors that are not only trying to predict the hugely complex climate environment and other factors that affect the future, but also future regulation. You've got to take all these into account somehow in forming judgments about investments or indeed about the underlying standards that should be set. A lot of this we just don't know. There are certain things we know. We know that there's a problem coming. We can see the evidence of it. Just read some of the narrative reports on climate, which I find much more worrying than some of the numbers. You see what's happening in the tundra with sort of mammoth tooth suddenly being exposed and methane released as a result of climate change, and completely unanticipated changes in the environment coming about. So we cannot be precise. That's the important thing. There's a phrase one of my companies that I've been involved with has used, you can't predict, but you can prepare. And it's the mindset that you use to prepare, the way that you think about how to deal with different eventualities, that's actually much more important than trying to get any one thing right. When I see the debate that's going on today, there's debates at various levels within the sustainability community. You take the debate over the ISSB and single and double materiality, for example. There's a huge debate between sustainability advocates and others over what should be done to set the right standards for the future and the right tools for the future. The ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board that's just been set up, which I think is a transformational body that is going to simplify and make the application of tools in relation to sustainability so much easier for everyone. You've got all this debate on the one hand.
I was curious. I'm glad you brought that up.
So on the one hand, you've got huge arguments within the sustainability community, and then you've got the massive pushback from people who are on the other side of the debate, saying that none of this can be precisely defined and therefore it can't be used. And there's arguments between different valuation specialists over what can and can't be modelled. There's a whole range of things that are replicating exactly the same kinds of flaw in the thinking that was taking place initially in finance 20 odd years ago, 40 years ago, in fact, when these models were first being deployed and tested. Same sort of thing happening now. The whole mindset needs to change. There's got to be a much more pragmatic mindset, recognizing you're never going to get anything precisely right, but the important thing is that there is action, that various tools are developed, there is support given to them, they see how they work, and then you modify them over time. It's one of the most critical things is you can't set in train a particular standard or tool and then expect it to be right forever. There's got to be a way of changing the way that the tool works over time. And it's this kind of mindset that I think will make a fundamental difference. It will reconcile, if people can get the process right, the debates between what some people rather controversially have called the sustainability Taliban on the one hand and the sustainability flat earthers on the other. And those are just the extremes of a typology where there's a whole host of different opinions and positions being taken by different parties and stakeholders in between. They have to be brought together and reconciled to some tools that are going to work, and it's got to be done quickly. So I think getting the mindset right is really important.
And that mindset, Greg, you're talking about is the no single right way mindset.
Yeah.
Is that right?
No single right way.
When we say mindset, we're saying no single right way.
Yeah. Each tool needs to be judged by whether it delivers the results intended, whether it's gaining the support, which is essential for any tool, and crucially, whether it evolves effectively over time. You take the International Sustainability Standards Board, when they start producing standards, they'll kick off what matters, because of they're focusing on what is material for investors and for shareholder value. What is material is that they develop those standards over time to learn from what happens in the marketplace, what happens in the wider world. There's, getting a standard right at the beginning forever is unrealistic. It's got to be pragmatic. To bring people together, one of the most important parts of the whole mindset is delivering the results intended. And this is where I think a lot of the debate has sprung up, because people talk about ESG meaning different things. On the one hand, is it an ethical tool related to sustainability? On the other hand, is it simply a way of understanding organizational behavior? Or thirdly, is it a way of measuring risk? The sustainability advocates would go for the first. Some of the finance specialists, like Alex Edmonds, the professor at London Business School, are focused on the second. And a lot of people are now characterizing some of the leading ESG indices, such as those from MSCI, Morgan Stanley Capital International, which is the leader in the field, as doing no more than measuring risk. The fact is, ESG type tools are capable of doing all of those things, as long as people pick the right tool for the job and recognize what the tool is doing, what it's not doing, and actually select the right mix of tools to enable them to achieve the end results that they want.
I think that makes so much sense. It really does. I think that the discussion of how we value companies more generally and all these finance tools really does an incredible job of parsing out the different sides of this debate. So I guess my next question for you, some of it, once you say it, it seems so obvious and practical, but it wasn't until you said it, right? So I'm curious, are there other obvious points that people are missing today in these discussions?
I think the basic one is the mindset, and actually the point that you read out a few minutes ago, the idea that ESG type tools are empirically based, forward-looking, and have considerable advantages over tools that are theory-based and backwards-looking. And I haven't heard that argument used nearly enough in shaping the overall debate between the various parties involved in trying to establish what should be done with sustainability, ESG, and all the issues that have now blown up with resolutions in various states in America. A second factor relates directly to that, and this is something I'm intrigued by, which is when you look at what the state of Florida have done, they are saying that investment decisions by bodies associated with the state need to focus solely on pecuniary factors, which exclude in their book a lot of factors that relate to ESG. But if you look, pecuniary in my book is equivalent to cash, and there are certain valuation authorities, particularly centered on McKinsey, the consulting firm, and Wharton, with Heinitz there, have argued that ESG can be integrated into cash projections. They've come up with 5 different ways in which it comes through, which it strikes me as a pretty good start to reconcile people. And if the debate in Florida was to be put to positive use, it might be to start with that and see how far can that kind of definition go. Now, others are disagreeing with it. There's other views as to how easily some of these ESG measures can be factored into cash flows and other things. There's some people would argue that you just reflect it in the discount rate that you put into your valuation model. And a third category of argument is to say these factors are intrinsic, which is one associated with Alex Edmonds, and therefore you can't quantify the value precisely. You've got to think about the value in different ways. Somehow you've got to deal with all of that, but actually seeing how far you can go with translating ESG into cash and whether it works or not is a pretty good start, because once you've done that, you can show that to some of these people who have, I'm sure, very good reasons for taking an anti-ESG approach, that they can see how the different views can be reconciled. A third area, and is something that's perplexed me ever since I've seen it, is that there is a lot of data around now showing how things like organizational purpose drive financial returns. I saw back in 2019 research work done by George Serafin and a range of academic colleagues that showed that there was a fantastic correlation between future returns on equity and the sense of purpose expressed in some very big general surveys, the Good Place to Work survey, by middle managers. Intriguingly, there was no correlation between the purposes expressed by senior managers and returns. But if you got into the organization and looked at what happened at middle management level, there was a fantastic correlation. In all the webinars and other written communications on purpose, of which there have been a huge volume, this kind of research gets very little attention. And yet, looking at returns in companies overall, it's hugely important. And it shows how ESG type tools could be harnessed very positively in a pro-finance, pro-investment return way. So those are the three factors I think that could be made more of today. The stronger foundations for ESG type tools, trying to translate them into cash and other ways, and actually just seeing how closely they can be reconciled with existing ways that finance works. And thirdly, harnessing some of the evidence on organizational factors and the way that those correlate to returns on equity and a host of other matters, just not being made enough use of, all because of the rather partisan debate that has blown up. And there's a fourth point as well, which is what I've got coming next.
Can you give us a preview? What's coming
I
next?
certainly can. Nearly all the attention so far on sustainability, up until very recently, has focused on large companies. Started with large listed companies, it's moved to private equity companies. On the other hand, 50% or more of just about everything is accounted for by small companies, SMEs. Whether you look at economic activity, employment, emissions, and certainly innovation, it's the small companies that do it. And yet there's very little attention being given to them. Such attention as is being given relates to Scope 3 emissions, so making sure the big companies that are reporting on what their supply chains are doing in terms of sustainability, which is going to put further pressure on these small companies, which just at the moment have got just every challenge that you can imagine in terms of costs, inflation, access to skills, a whole host of things that are making life very difficult for the small company world. There's some really easy ways to address that, which would be what I'm focused on next. Countless examples in my experiment of how large companies transform the fortunes of small companies by working with them, and indeed transform the fortunes of the big companies as well, because this is the way that they get innovation to do things in a new way in the future. And along with purpose and all these other things that are included in the ESG world, there's a very, very strong, compelling case for looking at the way that big companies and small companies work together. There's already a recognition of partnering in the UN SDGs, SDG 17, Sustainable Development Goal number 17, partnering for the goals, but it purely looks at public-private partnering. It doesn't look at the kinds of partnering between large companies and small. And I've got countless examples of how innovation is encouraged by this. And there's a really simple way of kicking off, which is trying a range of ways of looking at the partnership relationships between large companies and small. One of the most obvious is quickly about looking at how payments take place and how quickly large companies pay. One of the really surprising things is how several sustainability leaders with high ESG scores actually have very bad reputations for paying small companies. The UK set a target of 30 days for small companies to be paid. There are some names that will be very familiar and looked up to by your listeners on this podcast who pay 60, 70, even 80 days, and more than a quarter in many cases of their commitments and legal commitments to pay are not fulfilled in full. That's a massive change that could take place very, very easily and quickly. And in the process, it would deliver several hundred billion of funding effectively to small companies globally. And it's a very obvious thing to focus on. Obviously, when it comes to valuing a company, there's a lot of cash that goes out in doing this. But if you look at all the growth factors and a host of other factors that will come to play for the big company, those massively outweigh the relatively small amount of cash that might go out. So that's an area that needs lots of attention. There's an initiative in the UK to try to get payments to be done faster. And the one community that's not behind it, you've got all the business community, you've got the government, small businesses, large businesses, the works, other than investors. And it's an area where investors could make the difference between this just being talked about and actually happening. And that's what I think is one of the biggest things that should happen next, and which will be transformational all around.
I'm so amazed by this, Greg. I mean, I love talking to people from different disciplines, because we all think of things differently, or different things. I would have never correlated big companies paying their bills on time to sustainability, ESG, economic development, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Like, this is just mind blowing for me. And it's so true. I mean, I've been a small business owner for over a decade. It's incredible how these big firms will push you. And it's not your client, right? It's like the procurement department trying to give you 60-day payment terms or whatever. And you're like, I am a small business. I live off of this. How can you wait 60 days to pay me after the invoice? Because that effectively becomes like a 90-day window, because you're billing at 30 days. I personally understand the pain from a small business perspective, and I had not made that connection to partnerships for the goals for Sustainable Development Goal number 17. And you're absolutely right. It's all about public-private partnerships. It's not about how the system itself as a whole, the private sector, can work together to inject more cash in the economy, help the whole employee, the social side of things. It's just revolutionary for me. Thank you.
You've got it in a nutshell.
I really mean that.
That was a wonderful summary.
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you come up with next, Greg. Fascinating stuff here. Let's spend a moment. I mean, we've really gone very deep on a lot of things today. Let's think about, if you were to have folks come away with just a few key takeaways from this episode, they'll probably have to listen to it multiple times, as I know I will be listening to it multiple times to really grasp the depth of what you're saying. But what would your key takeaways be for anyone walking away from this podcast thinking that their head might explode?
Try and keep it very simple. Let's just focus on ESG for the moment. ESG is simply a new way of looking at finance and sustainability. And use your own phrase, it's everything not in the balance sheet. The ESG type tools are forward-looking and empirical, not backward-looking theory-based. Therefore, they're valuable compared to a lot that have been used traditionally in finance. It's important to separate the different purposes that they can be used for and judge them relative to what people want them to do, rather than thinking that there's one size fits all. One thing we haven't talked about, by the way, is the way that new technologies are embedding them and making them invaluable. You've described that at the introduction. This is definitely a change coming. And the loads of other points that sort of build the case in the pieces that I've published. One I would pick out is that in choosing the tools to use, separate between tools that look at outcome measures and enablers, the former being what is being delivered in terms of sustainability outcomes in the real world, and the enablers being the tools that judge the organizational practices that bring those and other outcomes about. the final thing I would say is this is a really exciting new era. A lot of the people that I worked with early in my career who were driving quarterly returns are now at very senior levels and in some cases retiring. I've been hugely excited to see some of the people who are the biggest advocates of quarterly reporting, this, that, and the other, turning round and putting the firms that they're running firmly behind these kinds of long-term measures. And I'm not just talking about small peripheral firms. I'm talking about firms right at the heart of the industry. They're genuinely behind this. I think this is a really exciting time for the finance industry. And if it's properly recognized, there's already a 40 trillion experiment that has been taking place in relation to ESG. If it's properly recognized, the value that brings, not just to sustainability outcomes, but also to long-term financial returns, and recognizes that the use of these techniques can do different things for different people, and sort of get away from the one-size-fits-all mentality. And I think we've got a very exciting decade or two ahead of us.
There's Greg's mic drop. Who said you weren't cool, Greg?
Thank you, Kaitlyn.
That was he just had a mic drop moment, you guys. All right, that is, I'm not going to say another word except thank you so much for being on. And we look forward to your next paper coming out. We'll probably have you back on to talk about that. But thank you very much for being here today and talking this through with us.
Thank you very much, Kaitlyn. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for reaching out and taking the time.